Toward the end of the 1850s, a writer known only as R makes a comment that really sums up what was happening in non-subscription at the time, and I think is one that we can learn a great deal from. He comments on the fact that there are two different traditions within non-subscription. He refers to, on the one side, the urge toward doctrine, and on the other, the urge toward freedom. So we have conservatives and liberals thinking about things in different ways. And he argues that when these forces are held together, we find non-subscription at its best, that these two forces working in cooperation with each other release the true dynamism of the nature of non-subscription. But the trouble is, if they don't work together, if they aren't held together, then the consequences can be disastrous, because all of that energy is dissipated in disagreement and fractiousness, really. We might quote W.B. Yeats, although in much graver circumstances, some decades later, things fall apart, the centre cannot hold. And really that's what was happening around 1860 in non-subscription, because although the new code that Montgomery had worked so hard for had been ratified and adopted, there were still issues around how it was implemented, and as a matter of fact, in some cases, it was just totally ignored. And this came to a head over the installation of jelly in Moneyreagh, because the provisions of the new code were not applied in that case. The situation is slightly more complicated, because when this came up for discussion in the Remonstrant Synod, McGuinness, the rebel, was actually clerk. So we have an interesting position of him being in a position of authority and also not agreeing with the details of the implementation of the code. Now, in the case of Moneyreagh, in the case of jelly, a compromise was found, and things were perfectly fine from then on. But disagreements and disruption continued, so that we find at the end of 1861 that York Street congregation, which is then in the Remonstrant Synod, applies to join the Presbytery of Antrim. Bear in mind that these are two completely distinct bodies at this time with different historical backgrounds. Another congregation, Carrickfergus congregation, also secedes, and this causes some disquiet in the Presbytery of Antrim. Claston Porter of Larne, for instance, writes of the danger of the Presbytery of Antrim becoming a receptacle for the Remonstrant Synod's rubbish. So fairly strong language. And what happens then is that the conservatives in the Presbytery of Antrim become concerned about this increasing liberalism with these new congregations coming in. And so some of the conservatives decide to split off. There's strong leadership from First Church for this, and they form the Northern Presbytery of Antrim. So we have the Northern Presbytery of Antrim, the Presbytery of Antrim, the Remonstrant Synod, and the Synod of Munster. And by this time, the Synod of Munster is also rather in disagreement with some of the views being expressed by the Northern Presbytery of Antrim. So we have a tendency for the extremes to burst out instead of things holding together as are really wanted. And the Presbytery of Antrim had its own issues at the time, because by the end of the 1850s, there were challenges emerging in Ballyclare congregation, and the issue there was the minister, Reverend Mr. Hall. And Reverend Mr. Hall was very interested in literature and also in scientific developments of the time, and apparently he caused horror for his congregation on one occasion by reading to them most of a Shakespeare play, if the accounts are to be believed. And he also introduced various scientific ideas to his congregation. Must bear in mind that at this time we're moving toward the theory of evolution. There are a lot of ideas around, and Hall was obviously interested in those. And some of his congregation really objected to this, to the extent that we find the congregation seeking to place itself in the Northern Presbytery of Antrim and the minister staying in the Presbytery of Antrim. And this situation becomes so extreme that it actually becomes a legal matter. And in the end, the legal decision is in favour of Hall, to the horror of the Conservatives. And he wins and remains in the more liberal Presbytery of Antrim. Now, the attitude to Hall among his congregation, certainly the remaining congregation, can be judged by the memorial that the congregation erected to him. There's a memorial in Ballyclare Church that reflects how highly regarded Paul was by his congregation. Now, the New Code, so far we've looked at it really in terms of theological discord and attitudes to theology differing. But some people were concerned that the New Code was a little bit ambiguous about church governance and gave too much authority to congregations. And so there were debates not only about theology, but about the system of governance. And some congregations were not satisfied even with the liberalism of the Presbytery of Antrim. They wanted greater freedom than that. And so in 1876, another 4 congregations broke away, Moneyreagh being one of them, to form something called the Free Congregational Union. And so by this time, we have a great many differences of opinion and a great many separate bodies. And non-subscription has lost its dynamism at this point.